Welcome, seekers of ancient wisdom, to another journey into the deepest shadows of Middle-earth's forgotten lore. Tonight, we shall unveil a truth that even the most learned scholars dare not whisper, a secret that dwells in the very heart of darkness itself. As you settle into comfort and let your mind drift upon the currents of time, prepare to witness the one fear that haunted the Dark Lord Sauron throughout the long years of the Second Age. A terror so profound, so primordial, that it shaped the very foundations of his empire and sealed the fate of countless souls. Let the gentle rhythm of these words carry you into the depths of history, where even gods tremble before forces older than memory itself. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and surrender to the tide of ancient secrets that shall wash over you like waves upon a distant shore. In the towering spires of Barad-dûr, where shadows gathered like storm clouds and the very stones pulsed with malevolent will, there stood a figure clothed in darkness and crowned with terrible majesty. Sauron the Deceiver, Lord of Mordor, master of the Rings of Power. His name alone could turn brave hearts to ice and bend the strongest wills to his design. Yet in the deepest hours of the night, when even his most faithful servants slumbered in their chambers of black stone, the Dark Lord would rise from his throne and pace the highest battlements of his fortress, his burning gaze turned not toward the lands he sought to conquer, but away from something far more ancient and infinitely more terrible. For beneath the armor of his magnificence, beneath the layers of power that he had woven about himself like a shroud of stars, there stirred a memory that would not die, a whisper of terror that no amount of dominion could silence. It came to him in dreams that were not dreams, in the space between sleeping and waking where truth dwells naked and unadorned. The sound of water, vast and measureless, rolling in endless rhythm against shores that no longer existed. The memory of depths so profound that even his immortal spirit had nearly dissolved within their embrace, scattered like salt upon the wind. The sea, that single word contained within it all the horror of his deepest nightmares, all the vulnerability that he dare not acknowledge even to himself. For while mortal men saw only waves and foam, tide and current, Sauron perceived something far more ominous, a living shadow of the Valor's power that had been woven into the very fabric of water itself. This was no mere element to be commanded or corrupted, but memory made manifest, ancient beyond even Morgoth's first rebellion, suffused with a consciousness that watched and waited with the patience of eternity itself. In those midnight hours, as the wind howled through the iron towers of his domain, Sauron would grip the stone parapet with fingers that could crush steel, and remember the taste of terror, salt and bitter, that had filled his throat as the very foundations of the world shifted beneath him. Remember the moment when all his careful plans, all his seductive whispers and golden promises had crumbled like sand before a force that recognized no master, acknowledged no dominion, and bowed to no will save that of its creators. The memory would fade with the coming of dawn, pushed back into the shadowed corners of his consciousness where it dwelt like a serpent coiled in darkness. But it never truly left him. In every decision, every strategy, every grand design for the conquest of Middle-earth, that primal fear shaped his choices like an invisible hand guiding a marionette. The great inland fortress of Barad-dûr, the roads that led always away from the coasts, the armies that marched over mountain passes rather than sailing swift upon the waves. All of it bore the mark of his secret terror, the fingerprint of a fear so deep that it had become the foundation upon which his entire empire was built. Yet none who served him knew, none suspected that their master, who had faced the wrath of the Valar themselves and emerged to rebuild his dominion from ash and ruin, harbored within his black heart a terror of something as simple as the endless blue horizon. For Sauron was nothing if not a master of deception, and his greatest deception was the one he practiced upon himself. The pretense that his careful avoidance of the western seas was merely strategy, merely the calculated decision of a commander who preferred the solid certainty of stone and earth to the treacherous uncertainty of wind and wave. But the sea remembered everything, and in its vast memory dwelt the echo of a day when the world itself had broken, when the very music of creation had shifted into a key of judgment and wrath that still reverberated through the depths like the tolling of some cosmic bell. The day when Númenor, that star among mortal kingdoms, had been swallowed whole by waters that rose like mountains to reclaim what the valor had granted and what pride had corrupted beyond all redemption. There are moments in the turning of the world when the very fabric of reality bends beneath the weight of divine judgment, when the patient mercy of the valor finally exhausts itself and gives way to wrath beyond all mortal comprehension. Such was the day when Númenor, the Blessed Isle, the greatest achievement of mortal craft and wisdom, became nothing more than a memory preserved in the songs of the sea. Picture, if you can, the majesty that was Ar-Pharazôn's fleet as it stretched across the western ocean like a forest of masts and sails, each ship a masterwork of Númenorian shipbuilding, each vessel carrying within its hull the hopes and dreams of a people who had forgotten their place in the music of the world. The King of Men, swollen with pride beyond all measure, had dared to set foot upon the undying lands themselves, believing that immortality could be seized by force of arms and strength of will. But the Valar, those powers who had shaped the world in its infancy and guided its growth through ages uncounted, would suffer no such blasphemy. Manwë, Lord of the Winds, lifted his voice in supplication to the one who dwells beyond the circles of the world, and Ilúvatar himself bent his thought upon the presumption of his children. The earth shook, the sky cracked like glass, and from the uttermost west there came a wave that was not merely water, but the physical manifestation of divine wrath given form and substance. Sauron had stood upon the steps of the great temple in Armenelos as the first tremors ran through the foundations of the island, his fair form still unmarred by the revelation of his true nature, his golden voice still honeyed with promises of power and glory. But as the horizon began to tilt and the very geometry of the world shifted around him, that beautiful mask began to crack, revealing glimpses of the darkness that lurked beneath. The wave, when it came, was taller than mountains. It rose from the western sea like the hand of judgment itself, blotting out the sun and casting all of Númenor into a shadow deeper than night. The sound of its approach was like thunder that would not end, like the roar of every storm that had ever been or ever would be concentrated into a single moment of absolute terror. Ships that had seemed as mighty as floating cities were tossed about like leaves in an autumn gale, their proud hulls splintering like kindling, their crews cast into waters that boiled with unnatural fury. And through it all, Sauron felt something that he had not experienced since his first rebellion against the music of creation, the ice-cold touch of absolute helplessness. All his power, all his cunning, all his mastery over the hearts and minds of mortal men meant nothing in the face of this elemental fury. The wave struck Númenor with the force of a falling star, and the island that had stood unconquered for 3,000 years vanished beneath the waters as though it had never been. But Sauron did not die with Númenor's sons and daughters. His spirit, dark and resilient as it was, endured even as his physical form was torn away by currents that pulled him down into depths beyond all measurement. For what felt like eternities, he tumbled through waters that were not merely wet but alive, conscious, filled with a presence that examined him with the thoroughness of a scholar studying a particularly loathsome specimen. The sea stripped away his beautiful disguise as a storm strips leaves from a tree, layer by layer, until nothing remained but the naked essence of his malice and corruption. In those drowning depths, surrounded by the ghosts of drowned kings and the wreckage of a civilization that had reached too high, Sauron learned the true meaning of fear, not the fear of defeat, which he had tasted before, nor the fear of pain, which was but a temporary inconvenience to one of his nature. This was something far more primal, the fear of dissolution, of being unmade not by violence but by something as patient and implacable as the tide itself. The sea did not hate him. Hatred would have been a comfort, for hate could be understood, manipulated, turned to one's advantage. Instead, it regarded him with the same distant indifference with which a scholar might observe a stain upon a manuscript, something to be cleansed away, not out of malice, but simply because cleanliness was the natural order of things. When at last the waters released him, casting his broken spirit upon the shores of Middle-earth like driftwood upon a beach, Sauron bore within his essence a scar that would never heal. The memory of that drowning lived on in every fiber of his being, a constant reminder that there were forces in the world beyond his power to corrupt or control. And though he would rebuild his strength, though he would forge new armies and craft new deceptions, though he would become once more a terror to shake the foundations of the world, he would never again willingly venture within reach of those waters that had so casually stripped away everything he believed himself to be. The fair form that had deceived the kings of Númenor was gone forever, dissolved in those primordial depths. When Sauron at last managed to clothe himself in flesh once more, it was the form of his malice made manifest, tall and terrible, wreathed in shadow and flame. But even this new shape trembled at the memory of water closing over his head, of depths that had no bottom, of a consciousness vast and alien that had examined his very soul and found it wanting. In the years that followed his return to Middle-earth, as Sauron slowly gathered his strength and began the long work of rebuilding his dominion over the hearts of men and the creatures of shadow, he displayed a cunning that bordered on genius in concealing his newfound weakness from those who served him. To his lieutenants, the Nazgûl who rode forth at his command, the orcs who marched beneath his banner, the men who bent their knee to his will, he appeared as he always had, a master of infinite power and boundless malice, capable of bending any force to his purpose and overcoming any obstacle through strength of will alone. Yet those who possessed the wisdom to read the signs, who could perceive the subtle patterns that revealed truth beneath the surface of appearances, began to notice certain peculiarities in their master's grand design. When Sauron chose the site for his great fortress of Barad-dûr, it was not upon some commanding height from which he might survey all the lands of Middle-earth, but in the heart of Mordor, as far from the western sea as the borders of his realm would allow. The great roads that he commanded his servants to build did not stretch westward to the havens where ships might carry his influence across the waters, but inland toward the mountains and the eastern realms where the sea's voice could not be heard. His armies, when they marched forth to carry his dominion to distant lands, took the long paths through mountain passes and across barren plains, even when swifter routes lay open along the coastal roads. Supply lines that could have been shortened by weeks through the use of ships were instead stretched across hundreds of leagues of difficult terrain, taxing his resources and slowing his conquests to a crawl. When his servants questioned these decisions, as the boldest among them sometimes dared to do, Sauron would fix them with his terrible gaze and speak of strategy, of the wisdom of keeping one's enemies uncertain of one's movements, of the folly of placing too much trust in the treacherous element of water. But in the deepest chambers of Barad-dûr, in the private spaces where no servant was permitted to tread, and no eye save his own might witness his moments of vulnerability, Sauron would sometimes pause in his great work and listen. Listen for the sound that haunted his dreams, the distant whisper of waves against some far shore, carried on winds that had traveled across leagues of open water. And when that sound reached his ears, as it sometimes did despite all his precautions, his hands would clench into fists and his burning eyes would dim with the memory of depths that had nearly claimed him forever. The irony was not lost upon him, though he would never acknowledge it even in the privacy of his own thoughts. He who had once walked among the Valar themselves as one of the Maiar, who had learned the secrets of creation at the feet of Aule the smith, who had commanded the loyalty of dragons and the fear of kings, now shaped his entire empire around the avoidance of something as simple as salt water. Every tower he raised, every road he ordered, built every battle plan he crafted, bore the invisible mark of his fear, the subtle but unmistakable signature of a power that dared not venture too close to the thing that had once unmade it. His servants, had they known, might have thought less of him for this weakness, or perhaps they might have feared him all the more, for what manner of force could inspire such terror in a being of his magnitude? But Sauron was far too skilled in the arts of deception to allow such knowledge to spread. He wove his fear into the very fabric of his strategy, disguising cowardice as wisdom, and presenting his limitations as choices freely made. When the mouth of Sauron asked why their master's gaze never turned toward the havens of Mithlond where Círdan the shipwright still held sway, Sauron spoke of the importance of securing the inland routes first, of the folly of overextending one's forces, of the wisdom of patience in the face of lesser priorities. And so the years passed, and Sauron's empire grew, but always with that strange hollow at its heart, a space shaped like the absence of water, a dominion that stopped precisely where the tide began. His orcs could march to the very edges of the sea, but they went no farther. His influence could corrupt kings and princes across the breadth of Middle-earth, but it somehow failed to take root in the hearts of those who made their living from the waves. His eye could pierce the darkness of distant lands and spy upon the secret counsels of his enemies, but it turned always away from the western horizon, as though some invisible barrier prevented his gaze from reaching beyond the edge of the world. For Sauron understood with a clarity that burned like acid in his thoughts that the sea was not merely an obstacle to be overcome or a challenge to be met with force of arms. It was something far more dangerous than any enemy he had ever faced. It was a reminder, a constant patient reminder of the moment when all his power had proven insufficient, when all his cunning had been stripped away like a mask in a hurricane, when he had been reduced to nothing more than a naked spirit drowning in waters that cared nothing for his ambitions or his rage. But if Sauron believed that his careful avoidance of the western waters would allow him to forget the terror of his drowning, he was gravely mistaken. For the sea, that vast consciousness that dwelt within every drop of salt water and every grain of sand upon the shore, possessed a memory far longer and more perfect than even the Eldar in their halls of stone and starlight. It remembered the first rains that had fallen upon Arda in the days of its making, remembered the tears of the Valar when they wept for the marring of the music, remembered every ship that had ever sailed upon its surface, and every soul that had ever been claimed by its depths. And it remembered Sauron, in the coastal villages of Gondor, where fishermen cast their nets into waters that sparkled like jewels beneath the morning sun. There began to spread stories that made even the bravest mariners hesitate before launching their boats. Sailors spoke in hushed whispers of voices that called to them from beneath the waves, not the seductive songs of sirens or the mournful cries of the drowned, but something far more unsettling, the sound of vast intelligence stirring in the depths, of ancient memory surfacing like some leviathan rising from the deepest trenches of the world. Those who had served aboard the ships of Númenor in the days before the downfall, the few survivors who had been far from their homeland when the wave fell, would sometimes wake in the deep watches of the night with tears upon their cheeks and words upon their lips that they did not remember speaking. They spoke of dreams in which they walked once more upon the marble quays of Romena, where the great ships had berthed beneath towers that scraped the belly of the sky. But in these dreams, the harbor was not as they remembered it. The water was darker, deeper, filled with a presence that watched and judged and remembered every slight ever offered against the majesty of the Valar. The Eldar, those immortal souls who had seen the rising of both sun and moon and witnessed the shaping of the world in its youth, began to gather in their secret councils to discuss phenomena that troubled even their ancient wisdom. Círdan, the shipwright, master of the Grey Havens and keeper of Narya the Red, spoke of changes in the behavior of the tides that followed no pattern known to those who studied the movements of moon and star. Ships that should have foundered in storms found themselves carried safely to harbor by currents that had no natural explanation. Others, vessels whose captains harbored dark purposes or carried cargo tainted by the shadow, discovered that no wind would fill their sails, and no current would bear them forward, leaving them becalmed in waters that seemed to stretch into infinity. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the reports that came from those who dared to sail the waters near the site of Númenor's drowning. For though the blessed isle itself had vanished beneath the waves, leaving no trace upon the surface of the sea, the waters above its grave remained forever changed. Sailors who ventured too near that accursed latitude spoke of experiencing a sensation unlike anything in their previous experience, a feeling as though vast eyes were watching them from the depths below, studying them with an intelligence so alien and so vast that it made their souls shrink within their bodies like children cowering before a thunderstorm. Some claimed to have seen shapes moving in the water beneath their keels, not fish or sea beasts, but forms that suggested architecture, the ghostly outlines of towers and palaces that had once stood proud beneath the sun, but now dwelt in eternal darkness. Others spoke of hearing music that seemed to rise from the very heart of the ocean, melodies so beautiful and so terrible that they could drive strong men to madness or reduce the proudest warriors to tears of longing for something they could never name. And always, threading through these tales like a silver cord, was the suggestion that the sea itself had become something more than it had been before the downfall. The drowning of Númenor had not merely added another tragedy to the long history of Middle-earth, It had awakened something that had slumbered in the depths since the music of creation first gave form to the world. The grief of Ulmo, Lord of Waters, over the destruction of his greatest work had somehow infused itself into every drop and current, creating a consciousness that was both utterly alien to the children of Iluvatar and yet deeply personally invested in their fate. This was the presence that Sauron felt watching him from across the leagues that separated his fortress from the nearest coastline. This was the intelligence that invaded his dreams with images of drowning and dissolution, that whispered to him in the language of tides and storms of the price that would be exacted for his crimes. For the sea did not merely remember Númenor's fall, it remembered his role in that catastrophe, his poisonous words that had turned Ar-Pharazôn's heart against the Valar, his corruption of the faithful into the destroyers of their own paradise. And unlike the men and elves who might forgive or forget, unlike even the Valar themselves who had shown mercy to their rebellious servants in ages past, the sea offered no redemption, no chance for repentance or reform. It was patient as only the Eternal could be patient, watching and waiting for the moment when Sauron's guard would drop, when his fear would overcome his cunning, when he would once again come within reach of waters that remembered everything and forgave nothing. Yet even as the sea stirred with memories of ancient grief and justice deferred, there remained upon the coasts of Middle-earth those who had never forgotten the true nature of its power, who had preserved through long generations of exile and sorrow the knowledge of what the western waters truly represented. These were the faithful of Númenor, the survivors of the downfall, who had been scattered like seeds upon the wind when their homeland vanished beneath the waves, and their descendants who still carried within their hearts the echo of songs sung in languages that no longer existed. In the great harbor of Pelargir, where the river Anduin met the sea and the white ships of Gondor rode at anchor like sleeping swans, there stood temples whose origins stretched back beyond the founding of the kingdom itself. These were not the grand monuments of stone and gold that mortal kings raised to celebrate their victories, but humble shrines where the sound of water lapping against worn steps provided the only music needed for worship. Here the descendants of those who had sailed east ahead of the great wave gathered in the hours before dawn to offer prayers, not to the Valar who dwelt beyond the circles of the world, but to their servants who moved within it, to Ose of the storms and Uinen of the calms, to the Maiar, who had been given dominion over wave and tide. To the casual observer, these devotions might have seemed like nothing more than the superstitions of a seafaring people, the natural tendency of those who made their living from the ocean to personify its moods and seek its favor through ritual and sacrifice. But those who possessed the wisdom to look deeper would have recognized something far more significant, a living connection to powers that Sauron himself feared to face, a chain of memory and loyalty that stretched unbroken from the present moment back to the very foundations of the world. The priests who tended these shrines spoke in whispers of signs and portents that would have seemed like madness to ears untrained in the deep lore of the western lands. They told of tides that rose and fell according to no pattern that mortal astronomy could explain, of currents that carried messages written in foam and kelp to those who possessed the skill to read them. Most significantly, they spoke of a growing awareness among their people that they were being watched, not with malice, but with something far more complex and infinitely more personal. For the sea remembered not only Sauron's crimes, but also the faithfulness of those who had resisted his seduction even unto death. It remembered Elendil the Tall and his sons, who had launched their ships into the teeth of the storm, rather than bend their knee to the corruption that had consumed their homeland. It remembered the tears of mothers who had watched their children board vessels bound for unknown shores, trusting in the mercy of powers they could no longer see or hear. It remembered the songs of hope that had been sung even as the wave rose to claim Númenor, the voices of those who chose to die as free children of Iluvatar rather than live as slaves to the shadow. And in remembering, the sea had made its own choice. Where Sauron's influence touched the hearts of men, turning them toward darkness and despair, the waters that lapped against the shores of Middle-earth carried a different message, one of hope deferred but not abandoned, of justice that might be slow in coming but would never be denied, of a love so vast and patient that it could encompass even the grief of worlds. This was why Sauron's agents found their efforts strangely thwarted when they sought to extend their master's influence into the coastal regions of Gondor and Arnor. Corruption that took easy root in the hearts of those who dwelt far inland seemed to wither and die when it encountered souls that had been touched by the sea's blessing. Ships carrying dark cargoes would find themselves driven by storms into harbors where the faithful waited to cleanse what could be cleansed and destroy what could not. Messages meant to sow discord and despair among the kingdoms of men in exile would arrive written in scripts that had been washed clean by salt spray, their poisonous words replaced by verses of ancient songs that spoke of hope beyond the reach of shadow. The lords of Gondor, those proud princes who traced their lineage back to the kings of Númenor, began to speak in their councils of a phenomenon that their scholars could neither explain nor ignore. Reports arrived with increasing frequency of Sauron's servants, orcs and men corrupted by the shadow, who would approach the coastlines of their realm with conquest in their hearts, only to flee in inexplicable terror before their feet had even touched the sand. Interrogation of prisoners revealed tales that seemed born of madness, accounts of voices calling from beneath the waves of the very water itself, rising up to block their path of visions that filled their minds with images of drowning and dissolution, until they could think of nothing, save the need to escape the sea's presence. At first, the wise men of Minas Tirith dismissed these reports as the fevered imaginings of broken minds, the natural result of questioning orcs whose loyalty to their master had already been shattered by defeat and capture. But as the accounts multiplied, and their details remained consistent across dozens of separate incidents, even the most skeptical began to acknowledge that something unprecedented was occurring along their borders. The truth, had they possessed the knowledge to recognize it, was both simpler and more profound than any of their theories could encompass. The sea had chosen its side in the great conflict that was even then building toward its climax, and that choice was reflected in every tide that blessed the shores of those who remained faithful to the light. Every storm that drove back the servants of darkness, every current that carried hope to hearts that had begun to despair. Sauron, brooding in his tower of iron and flame, could sense this growing opposition even though he could not fully comprehend its nature. His spies brought him reports of his failures along the coastlines. His generals spoke in hushed tones of the inexplicable reluctance of their troops to approach the western waters. And still he maintained the pretense that these setbacks were merely temporary inconveniences, strategic adjustments necessitated by the complex nature of his grand design. But in the deepest hours of the night, when even the fires of Mount Doom burned low, and the only sound in all of Mordor was the whisper of wind through iron battlements, Sauron would sometimes climb to the highest chamber of Barad-dûr and gaze westward toward horizons he dared not approach, and in those moments, listening to the silence that stretched between his fortress and the distant sea, he would remember the taste of salt water filling his lungs, the sensation of dissolution that had nearly claimed him in the depths of the world's wrath, and he would know with terrible certainty that his greatest enemy was not Gil-galad or Elrond, or any of the other lords who opposed him, but something far more patient, far more implacable, far more intimately connected to the very foundations of existence itself. As the years of the Second Age drew toward their climactic conclusion, and the power of Sauron waxed great in the eastern lands while the kingdoms of the faithful held fast to their coastal strongholds, the Dark Lord found his dreams increasingly haunted by visions that seemed to rise from depths beyond all measurement. These were not the nightmares of memory that had plagued him since the downfall of Númenor, though they bore certain unmistakable similarities to those earlier torments. Instead, they possessed a quality of immediacy, of prophecy, that made his spirit recoil even as his conscious mind struggled to dismiss them as mere phantoms of his own fear. In these visions, Sauron found himself standing once more upon a shore, but not the familiar beaches of Middle-earth where he had first dragged his broken form from the wreckage of the drowned isle. This was a coastline that existed in no geography that mortal cartographers had ever mapped, a place where the boundary between sea and sky had dissolved into an infinity of blue-green depths that pulsed with their own internal light. The waves that lapped at his feet were not water as he understood it, but liquid memory, each drop containing within it the accumulated experiences of every soul that had ever been touched by the sea's blessing or claimed by its wrath. And rising from those phosphorescent depths came shapes that defied description, not monsters or leviathans as his waking mind might have expected, but forms that suggested architecture on a scale to dwarf even the greatest works of Númenor at its height. Towers that spiraled upward through leagues of water, their surfaces covered in script that writhed and flowed like living things. Halls whose vastness could have contained entire mountain ranges, their walls echoing with music that was older than the sun. Gardens of coral and kelp that bloomed with flowers of pure light, tended by beings whose beauty was so terrible that even glimpsing them filled his heart with a longing that was indistinguishable from anguish. But most disturbing of all, in the center of this impossible realm, there stood a figure that Sauron recognized with a shock of terror that penetrated even the strange detachment of the dream state. It was Ulmo himself, Lord of Waters, one of the Valar who had shaped the world in its youth, and whose dominion extended over every drop of moisture from the smallest dewdrop to the vastest ocean. But this was not Ulmo, as he had appeared in the days of Sauron's service among the Mire, when the Dark Lord had walked among the powers as one who might yet be redeemed. This was Ulmo transformed by grief, his majesty tempered with a sorrow so profound that it had crystallized into something approaching wrath. The Vala's eyes, when they turned upon Sauron in his dream, held no trace of the mercy that had once stayed the hand of divine judgment. They were the eyes of one who had watched his greatest work destroyed by the corruption of a single fallen Maya, who had seen the children he loved most dearly choose darkness over light and drag their entire civilization down with them into the depths. And in those eyes, Sauron saw reflected not just the memory of what had been, but the promise of what was yet to come. A reckoning that had been building like a tide for centuries, waiting only for the proper moment to crash down upon the shores of Middle-earth with the force of divine justice made manifest. "Do you think," Ulmo spoke, and his voice was the sound of every storm that had ever raged and every calm that had ever blessed the waters of the world, "that distance can protect you from the consequences of your choices? Do you imagine that by building your fortress far from the reach of my waves, you have somehow escaped the judgment that awaits all who corrupt the gifts of Ilúvatar?" Sauron tried to speak, to summon the golden tongue that had once swayed kings and princes to his will, but found that the words turned to salt upon his lips and dissolved before they could take shape. The dream sea around him began to churn with increasing violence, waves rising like mountains to tower above even his terrible height, each crest crowned with foam that sparkled with the light of stars that had never shone in any earthly sky. "You poisoned the minds of my children," the Vala continued, his form beginning to blur and expand until it seemed to encompass the entire horizon, turned their hearts against the very powers who had lifted them from dust and granted them dominion over the circles of the world. You made them believe that immortality could be seized rather than received, that wisdom could be stolen rather than earned, that the gifts of the Valar were prizes to be won through conquest rather than blessings to be accepted through faith. The water around Sauron's feet began to rise, no longer the gentle lapping of waves against sand, but a deliberate, inexorable flood that sought to claim him as it had once before. He tried to flee, to spread his spirit like wings and escape the confines of this aquatic nightmare, but found himself held fast by chains he could not see, anchored to this place of judgment by the weight of his own crimes. And now Ulmo's voice became the roar of a tsunami, the crash of breakers against cliffs that could shatter mountains. You cower in your tower of iron and flame, believing that if you simply avoid the sight of my realm, you can escape the consequences of your rebellion. But the sea remembers, Sauron Gorthar. The sea remembers everything, and the time of forgetting is coming to an end. The waves crashed over him then, not with the sudden violence of the downfall, but with the slow, patient persistence of tides that wear away stone through countless repetitions of their ancient rhythm. And as the water closed over his head, Sauron experienced once again that unique terror of dissolution, the fear that his very essence would be scattered like salt across the vastness of the deep, leaving nothing behind but the memory of darkness that had briefly troubled the peace of the world. He would wake from these dreams with a cry that echoed through the chambers of Barad-dûr, causing his servants to tremble and wonder what manner of torment could afflict even the mind of their master. But when they came to inquire about his distress, they would find him standing at the great window that looked eastward toward the rising sun, his burning gaze fixed firmly away from the western horizon, where the sea waited with the patience of eternity itself. And in those moments, as the reality of his fortress reasserted itself around him, and the familiar weight of his physical form reminded him that he was no longer drowning in primordial depths. Sauron would feel something that he had not experienced since the early days of his rebellion, a profound uncertainty about the ultimate outcome of his grand design. For the first time in millennia, he began to wonder if there might be forces arrayed against him, that even his vast power could not overcome enemies that could not be corrupted or controlled or defeated through any stratagem within his knowledge. The sea was patient, the sea was vast, and the sea, he was beginning to understand, was no longer merely watching. The first signs that Sauron's careful avoidance of the western waters might not be sufficient to protect him from their influence came in the form of what his servants reported as a series of unfortunate coincidences, natural disasters that seemed to strike his forces with peculiar timing whenever they attempted to extend his dominion toward the coastal regions of Middle-earth. A fleet of black ships launched from the southern ports that served his earthly allies would find itself scattered by storms that rose from cloudless skies, their wreckage washing ashore near settlements of the faithful like grim gifts delivered by an invisible hand. Armies marching to bring the Shadow's influence to the harbor towns of Gondor would discover that every river they needed to cross had inexplicably flooded, transforming gentle streams into raging torrents that swept away bridges and supply trains with equal indifference. To the Dark Lord's mortal servants, these setbacks appeared to be nothing more than the natural hazards that any military commander must learn to accept and work around. Weather was unpredictable, rivers were treacherous, and the sea had always been a dangerous environment for those who sought to make war upon its surface. But Sauron himself, brooding in the uppermost chamber of Barad-dûr, as reports of these failures reached his ears, recognized a pattern that filled his heart with a dread he dare not acknowledge even to himself. The storms struck only his vessels, leaving the ships of fishermen and merchants untouched, even when they sailed through the same waters on the same days. The floods affected only the rivers that his armies needed to cross, while streams that served no strategic purpose continued to flow within their banks as they had for centuries uncounted. Most tellingly of all his own attempts to scry the coastal regions through his palantir, the seeing stone that allowed his vision to range across vast distances were met with an impenetrable wall of mist and spray that no effort of will could penetrate. It was as though the sea itself had declared war upon him, marshaling its vast resources with the strategic precision of a general who had studied his every move and anticipated his every stratagem. And perhaps most disturbing of all, this opposition seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker with each passing season, as though some slumbering intelligence was gradually awakening to full consciousness of the threat he represented. The breaking point came when Sauron, driven by a combination of rage and desperation that he would have been ashamed to acknowledge, decided to test the limits of this aquatic hostility through a direct challenge that would either break the power arrayed against him or confirm his worst fears about the nature of his opposition. He commanded his servants to construct a great fleet in the hidden harbors of Umbar, black ships of war whose very appearance upon the horizon would strike terror into the hearts of his enemies. These vessels would sail north along the coast of Gondor, carrying fire and destruction to every port and fishing village they encountered, demonstrating to all the world that Sauron's dominion extended over wave and tide no less than stone and earth. The fleet that took shape in Umbar's yards was a masterwork of dark craftsmanship, each ship built not merely to carry warriors and siege engines, but to serve as a floating monument to the inevitability of Sauron's victory. The hulls were carved from trees that had been watered with the blood of sacrifices, their figureheads shaped into forms of such malevolent beauty that sailors who looked upon them for too long would find their loyalty to light and hope gradually eroding away. The sails were woven from silk that had been dyed in the darkness of Mordor's skies, and when they billowed in the wind, they seemed to cast shadows that were deeper and more absolute than any natural darkness should have been. When at last this armada set sail from the southern ports, riding the morning tide toward their appointment with destiny along the coasts of Gondor, even Sauron allowed himself a moment of anticipation. If the sea truly possessed the consciousness and will that his fears suggested, it would surely act to protect the shores it had blessed with its favor. And if it did not, if these reports of supernatural opposition were merely the fevered imaginings of servants who sought excuses for their own incompetence, then the path would be clear for him to extend his influence westward toward the Grey Havens, where Círdan kept his vigil, and perhaps even beyond to the shores where the light of Valinor still touched the waters at the edge of the world. The answer came with a swiftness that left no room for doubt about the intelligence behind it. When the Black Fleet reached the latitude where Númenor's ruins lay hidden beneath the waves, the sea around them began to change in ways that defied every law of nature that mortal science had ever discovered. The water itself turned dark, not with the familiar darkness of deep ocean, but with something that seemed to absorb light rather than simply reflecting it. The temperature dropped so suddenly that ice began to form along the waterline of the ships, despite the fact that they sailed in southern waters where frost was unknown even in the depths of winter. And then came the voices. At first, the sailors thought they were hearing the cries of seabirds or the groaning of their ship's timbers as they rode the increasingly violent swells. But as the sounds grew clearer and more distinct, even the most hardened warriors among Sauron's servants began to understand that they were listening to something far more disturbing than any natural phenomenon. These were the voices of the drowned, not the random babbling of souls lost beneath the waves, but a chorus of accusation that spoke in languages some of the sailors recognized and others that predated any tongue still spoken in Middle-earth. They heard the last words of Númenorian princes, who had died calling upon the mercy of the Valar, even as the wave rose to claim them. They heard the final prayers of ship captains who had gone down with their vessels, rather than abandon their crews to the mercy of the storm. Most terrible of all, they heard their own names being spoken by voices that knew not just their identities but their histories, their crimes, their secret fears and hidden shames, all catalogued with the meticulous precision of scholars who had devoted eternity to the study of mortal weakness. The wind rose then, not gradually as storms typically built, but all at once, as though some vast intelligence had decided that subtlety was no longer required. Waves that had been merely rough became mountainous swells that tossed even the largest ships about like toys in the hands of a petulant child. The sky darkened until the noon sun was no more than a dim ember struggling to pierce the supernatural gloom that had settled over the waters like a blanket woven from the grief of ages. But even as his fleet was torn apart by forces beyond any mortal power to resist, even as his carefully crafted vessels were reduced to splinters and kindling by winds that howled with voices of their own, Sauron received through his connection to the Palantir a vision that struck him with terror far greater than any physical destruction could have inspired. For just a moment, as the last of his black ships vanished beneath waves that sparkled with their own phosphorescent light, he saw through the eyes of a drowning sailor the form that rose from the depths to claim the wreckage. It was vast beyond all measurement, a presence that seemed to encompass the entire ocean from surface to floor, and yet it was also intimately personally focused upon him across the leagues that separated his fortress from the site of his fleet's destruction. Eyes that held the accumulated sorrow of every soul ever lost at sea, fixed upon him with an attention so complete, so absolute, that he felt as though his very essence was being examined and weighed and found wanting by a consciousness older than the foundations of the world. And in that moment of perfect clarity, Sauron understood at last the true nature of his situation. The sea was not simply opposing him, it was preparing to judge him. And when that judgment came, there would be no fortress deep enough, no shadow dark enough, no power great enough to shield him from waters that remembered everything and forgave nothing at all. In the aftermath of the destruction of his fleet, as reports of the catastrophe reached the Dark Tower through the trembling lips of the few survivors who had somehow managed to drag themselves to shore, Sauron faced a choice that would define the remainder of his dominion over Middle-earth. He could acknowledge the reality of the force arrayed against him, admit to himself and his servants that there were limits to his power, that even his vast will could not overcome, and reshape his grand design to account for this fundamental weakness. Or he could retreat deeper into the fortress of his own pride, turning away from the western waters not in fear, but in calculated disdain, presenting his inability to challenge the sea as a strategic decision made by one whose vision encompassed victories too vast for lesser minds to comprehend. Being who he was, the choice was never truly in doubt. When the mouth of Sauron came before his master's throne to deliver the grim accounting of ships lost and warriors drowned, He found the Dark Lord not in the posture of one who had suffered a defeat, but seated in majesty with his burning gaze fixed upon maps that showed only the inland regions of Middle-earth. The coastal areas had been carefully excised from these charts, as though they simply did not exist, leaving behind a geography that stopped abruptly at some invisible boundary beyond which the cartographer's art feared to venture. "The western waters," Sauron declared in a voice that allowed no contradiction, "have served their purpose in our greater design. Let our enemies waste their strength in maintaining fleets and harbors, in watching horizons that will never bring them aid. Our dominion shall be built upon foundations of stone and earth, upon the loyalty of those who understand that true power comes not from the treacherous element of water, but from the eternal strength of mountain and plain." And so began the great inward turning that would characterize the final phase of Sauron's empire, the systematic reshaping of his entire civilization around the principle of avoiding that which he could not control. The roads that had once been planned to extend his influence to every corner of Middle-earth were rerouted to avoid the coastal regions, creating a transportation network that curved around the western lands, like water flowing around a stone. The great works of engineering that his servants had been commanded to build, the fortresses and watchtowers, the bridges and monuments that would stand as eternal testaments to his glory, were all positioned with careful attention to keeping them beyond the reach of any flood or storm surge that might carry the sea's influence inland. Most significantly of all, when Sauron turned his attention to the crafting of the Rings of Power, those masterworks of his art that would serve as the foundation stones of his dominion over the hearts and wills of all the peoples of Middle-earth, he chose to ground their power not in the elemental forces that moved through water and air, but in the deeper magics that dwelt within stone and metal, earth and flame. The ring that he forged for himself in the fires of Mount Doom was a thing of gold and malice that drew its strength from the bones of the world itself, from forces so fundamental that no flood could wash them away. No storm could scatter them like leaves upon the wind. This was not cowardice, he told himself during the long nights when he stood upon the battlements of Barad-dûr and felt the distant pull of tides he would never again dare to challenge. This was wisdom. This was the calculated decision of a strategic mind that understood the importance of choosing one's battles, of building upon strengths rather than exposing weaknesses to enemy exploitation. If the sea wished to remain forever beyond his reach, then let it guard its empty horizons while he claimed dominion over everything that truly mattered. The lands where mortal men built their cities and raised their children, the mountains where the wealth of the earth lay waiting to be extracted, the forests where the ancient powers still slumbered in root and branch. But for all his careful rationalization, for all the elaborate justifications he constructed to explain why his empire should stop precisely where the waves began, Sauron could not entirely escape the knowledge that his grand design had been fundamentally compromised by forces beyond his control. Every map that showed the truncated boundaries of his influence served as a reminder of the limitation that he dare not acknowledge. Every report from his spies that spoke of the continuing prosperity of the coastal kingdoms was evidence of a realm that would forever remain beyond his grasp. And in the deepest hours of the night, when even his iron will could not entirely suppress the memories that haunted him, he would sometimes dream of what might have been if his power had proven sufficient to challenge the dominion of the western waters. He envisioned fleets that could sail beyond the edge of the world itself, carrying his influence to shores where the light of the two trees still lingered in the halls of the Valor. He imagined armies that could march across the surface of the sea as easily as they crossed mountain passes, bearing his banner to islands that existed only in the secret songs of the Eldar. But always these dreams would dissolve like foam upon the shore when he remembered the taste of salt water filling his lungs, the sensation of his carefully crafted form being stripped away layer by layer, until nothing remained but the naked essence of his rebellion. And he would wake with the absolute certainty that the sea was still out there, waiting with the patience of eternity itself, for the moment when his guard would drop and his fear would overcome his pride, drawing him once more within reach of waters that had already judged him once and found him wanting. The irony was not lost upon him, though he would never speak of it even in the privacy of his own thoughts. He who had once walked among the Valar as one of the Maiar, who had learned the deepest secrets of creation and craftsmanship, who had commanded the fear of dragons and the loyalty of kings, had allowed his entire empire to be shaped by avoidance of something as simple as salt water. His fortress, his roads, his armies, his very conception of what constituted territory worth claiming. All of it bore the invisible signature of a power that had learned to fear the one force in Middle-earth that could not be corrupted, controlled, or conquered through any art within his knowledge. But fear, as Sauron had learned long ago, could be transformed into a source of strength if one possessed the will to embrace it properly. And so he made his peace with the boundaries that had been imposed upon his ambitions, turning his attention fully to the mastery of those lands that remained within his reach. If he could not rule the sea, then he would become so mighty upon the earth that even the Valar would tremble before his power. If he could not corrupt the waters that had judged him, then he would ensure that everything they protected would eventually wither and fade, leaving behind only the darkness that he had chosen to serve. Yet even as Sauron convinced himself that his strategic withdrawal from the western waters represented wisdom rather than weakness, the consequences of that decision began to manifest in ways that would ultimately prove far more significant than the immediate tactical advantages he had gained. For the sea, in its vast patience and perfect memory, had not been content merely to repel his advances and guard its chosen shores from his influence. It had been preparing, with the meticulous care of a gardener tending seedlings, to nurture the very forces that would rise to challenge his dominion over Middle-earth. In those same waters that Sauron's fleets dared not traverse, where storms had scattered his black ships like leaves upon an autumn wind, the descendants of Númenor's survivors had been quietly rebuilding their strength. The sons of Elendil, guided by currents that seemed to flow according to no natural law, and blessed by winds that filled their sails, even when the air lay still around other vessels, had established new havens along the coasts of Middle-earth. These were not merely ports and trading posts, but beachheads of hope in a world increasingly overshadowed by the growing power of Mordor. From Pelargir in the south to the Grey Havens in the north, a network of harbors took shape that served as more than simple refuges for ships and sailors. They became repositories of memory, places where the songs of drowned Númenor were preserved, and the ancient loyalties to the Valar were maintained despite the growing darkness in the east. The ships that sailed between these havens carried more than cargo and passengers. They bore messages of resistance plans for alliance, and most importantly of all, the living proof that there remained in Middle-earth forces that Sauron's power could not touch. The irony was exquisite in its completeness. By avoiding the western waters out of fear for his own safety, Sauron had inadvertently preserved the very mechanism by which his enemies could coordinate their resistance to his rule. The sea that he dared not challenge had become a highway for those who would stand against him, a realm where his spies could not venture and his influence could find no purchase. While his attention was focused on the inland kingdoms that he could corrupt and control, the seeds of his eventual downfall were being watered by tides that remembered the justice of the Valar and nurtured the hope of those who remained faithful to the light. This became most apparent when reports began to reach the Dark Tower of strange ships that sailed the western waters with impunity, vessels that bore upon their masts the silver tree and 7 stars of Elendil's house. These were not the crude boats of fishermen or the merchant vessels that typically plied the coastal routes, but proud ships of war whose very presence upon the horizon seemed to kindle hope in the hearts of those who had begun to despair of any rescue from the growing shadow. They moved with purpose and coordination that suggested careful planning, appearing simultaneously at ports across the length of Middle-earth's western coast as though guided by intelligence that transcended mortal capabilities. When Sauron's servants attempted to gather information about these vessels to learn where they had been built and who commanded them, they found themselves frustrated at every turn by a conspiracy of silence that seemed to encompass every sailor, fisherman, and harbor master along the coast. Those who were questioned would speak freely of weather and tides, of fish runs and trading opportunities, but the moment the conversation turned to the silver-sailed ships, their eyes would grow distant and their tongues would become still, as though some power greater than fear had sealed their lips against betraying the secrets of the sea. The truth, had Sauron possessed the courage to seek it out through his own observation, would have filled him with a terror far greater than any he had yet experienced. For these ships were not merely the product of mortal craftsmanship, but vessels that had been blessed by powers that dwelt beyond the circles of the world. Their hulls had been shaped by shipwrights who remembered the techniques used in Númenor's greatest yards, their sails woven by hands that had learned their art from the Eldar themselves. Most significantly of all, their crews included not just the sons and daughters of mortal men, but beings whose nature partook of both sea and spirit Maiar, in service to Ulmo, who had taken forms that could walk upon deck and shore, while remaining always connected to the vast consciousness that moved within every drop of salt water. These were the vessels that would carry Elendil and his sons to the shores of Middle-earth when Númenor's final hour came, guided through storms that would have destroyed any lesser craft by currents that flowed according to the will of the Valar themselves. They were the ships that would bear the Palantiri and the sword of kings, the white trees sapling, and all the other treasures of the faithful that were destined to serve as the foundation stones of kingdoms yet to come. And they sailed freely through waters that Sauron's own vessels could not traverse without facing destruction, protected by forces that he had learned to fear more than any earthly army. But perhaps most galling of all, from the perspective of one whose entire existence had been devoted to the corruption and control of others, was the knowledge that his very fear of the sea had become a source of strength for his enemies. The coastal peoples of Middle-earth, those who made their living from fishing and trading, had begun to understand through subtle signs and whispered rumors that their Lord of Darkness harbored a terror of the waters that lapped at their shores. This knowledge had kindled in their hearts a flame of hope that no amount of propaganda or intimidation could extinguish, the understanding that even the mightiest of tyrants could be held in check by forces beyond his control. In the taverns of port cities and the gathering halls of fishing villages, songs began to be sung that would have earned their singers a swift death, had Sauron's agents understood their true meaning. These were not the obvious ballads of resistance that his spies were trained to detect and suppress, but subtle verses that spoke of tides that turn and storms that pass, of horizons that remain forever beyond the reach of earthbound powers, no matter how mighty they might appear. To casual listeners, they seemed like nothing more than the traditional songs of seafaring folk, celebrations of the eternal dance between wind and wave that had provided the soundtrack to maritime life since time immemorial. But to those who possessed the wisdom to understand their deeper significance, these songs carried a message of profound hope. They spoke of limits that could not be transcended, of boundaries that even the greatest powers must respect, of forces in the world that remained forever pure and uncorrupted, no matter how deep the surrounding darkness might grow. And in carrying that message, they served as a form of resistance more potent than any army, for they reminded all who heard them that tyranny, no matter how absolute it might appear, always contained within itself the seeds of its own eventual defeat. As the Second Age drew toward its tumultuous close, and the final confrontation between light and shadow prepared to unfold across the battlefields of Middle-earth, Sauron found himself facing the ultimate test of the strategy he had pursued since his humiliation in Númenor's waters. The War of the Last Alliance brought against him enemies more formidable than any he had previously encountered. Gil-galad, the Elven King with his host of immortal warriors, Elendil the Tall with the survivors of the faithful, who had been tempered by exile and loss into weapons of living hope, and Isildur, who bore within his heart the memory of his father's sacrifice and the promise of justice, too long delayed. Yet for all the magnificence of the armies arrayed against him, for all the power of the alliances that had been forged in the white councils of the wise, Sauron's confidence remained unshaken as he prepared for the final battle that would determine the fate of Middle-earth. Had he not built his empire upon foundations deeper than any that his enemies could claim? Had he not mastered the arts of corruption and control to such a degree that even the mightiest heroes could be turned to serve his will? Had he not, through careful strategy and patient planning, ensured that this ultimate confrontation would take place on ground of his choosing, far from the waters that had once nearly claimed his existence? But it was precisely in this confidence that the seeds of his downfall lay hidden, for Sauron had made the fundamental error of believing that by avoiding the western waters, he had somehow escaped their influence entirely. He had failed to understand that the sea's power extended far beyond the boundaries of wave and tide, that its memory and its judgment could be carried inland by currents more subtle than any that moved through wind or water. The very men who stood against him in the final battle bore within their hearts the blessing of waters he had learned to fear, the strength that came from knowing oneself to be protected by forces that transcended the merely physical realm. When the armies of the Alliance took the field before the Black Gate of Mordor, They fought not as desperate exiles making a final stand against inevitable defeat, but as instruments of a justice that had been building like a tide for centuries, waiting only for the proper moment to break upon the shores of tyranny, with the force of divine wrath made manifest. The swords they wielded had been blessed with water drawn from the sacred springs of Númenor before its fall. The banners they carried bore devices that recalled not just earthly kingdoms, but the very stars that had guided their ancestors across trackless seas to these shores of hope and promise. And when at last the combat came to its climax, when Sauron himself descended from his tower to face his enemies in personal battle, he found himself confronting not just the skill and courage of mortal warriors, but something far more profound and infinitely more dangerous. In the eyes of Isildur as he raised his father's sword, the Dark Lord saw reflected the depths of the Western Sea, the accumulated grief and wrath of waters that had waited long ages for this moment of reckoning. In the song that Gil-galad sang as he wielded his spear of light, Sauron heard echoes of the music that had shaped the world in its youth, melodies that called forth memories of a time when he too had served the light before pride and ambition led him into shadow. The battle itself was fought upon dry land, amid the ash and cinders of Mordor where no tide had ever flowed and no salt breeze had ever blown. But for all that, it was the sea that claimed the victory in the end. For the strength that filled the arms of Sauron's enemies came from sources deeper than muscle and bone, from wells of hope that had been fed by currents flowing out of the uttermost west. When Isildur's blade at last found its mark, and the ring was cut from the hand that had forged it, when the Dark Lord's physical form crumbled and his spirit fled screaming into the void, it was not merely the triumph of mortal courage over immortal malice, but the fulfillment of a prophecy written in foam and tide, the completion of a judgment that had begun when the first wave closed over Númenor's drowned towers. In his final moments of corporeal existence, as his carefully constructed form dissolved like salt in water, and his consciousness fled toward whatever refuge it might find in the desolate places of the world, Sauron experienced once more the terror of dissolution that had haunted him since the downfall. But this time, there was no hope of rebuilding, no chance to rise again in new flesh and renewed purpose. The sea had claimed its victory at last, not through direct confrontation, but through the patient nurturing of forces that would prove capable of accomplishing what wind and wave alone could not achieve. And so the Second Age ended as it had begun, with the vast waters of the Western Ocean lapping peacefully at shores that had been cleansed of shadow and restored to the light. But now those waters carried within their depths something they had not possessed before, the memory of justice accomplished, of patience rewarded, of a judgment rendered that would echo through all the ages yet to come. The Dark Lord had been defeated not by might of arms alone, but by forces he had learned to fear so deeply that he had shaped his entire empire around their avoidance, and in that avoidance had sown the seeds of his own destruction. In the years that followed, when bards sang of the War of the Last Alliance, and scholars recorded the deeds of heroes for the instruction of future generations, few would understand the true nature of the victory that had been won upon the fields of Mordor. They would speak of courage and sacrifice, of the triumph of good over evil and the power of alliance to overcome the mightiest tyranny. But the deepest truth, the secret that lay at the heart of Sauron's defeat, would remain hidden in the rhythm of waves against distant shores, in the eternal song of waters that remembered everything and forgave those who remained faithful to the light, while visiting upon the corrupt and rebellious a justice as patient as the tide and as inexorable as the turning of the world itself. And so, dear listeners, as our journey through the depths of this ancient mystery draws to its close, we find ourselves standing once more upon the shores of understanding, watching as the waves of revelation wash away the last remnants of shadow and deception. For in the end, the greatest terror that haunted the Dark Lord Sauron was not the prospect of military defeat or the loss of his precious ring, but the knowledge that there remained in Middle-earth forces beyond his power to corrupt or control. Forces as patient as eternity itself and as implacable as the justice of the one who dwells beyond the circles of the world. The sea remembers all things, preserves all truths, and in its vast embrace carries both the grief of ages past and the promise of redemption yet to come. It is the boundary between what can be corrupted and what must remain forever pure, the horizon beyond which even the mightiest tyrant dare not gaze lest he glimpse the reflection of his own inevitable doom. Let this ancient wisdom carry you now into peaceful sleep, knowing that some things in this world remain forever beyond the reach of darkness, as constant as the tide, and as eternal as the stars that guide lost ships safely home to harbor. The western waters still sing their ancient songs, and in their melody lies the promise that no shadow, however deep, can endure forever against the patient turning of the world toward light. Rest well, and dream of distant shores where the music of creation still echoes in wind and wave, world without end.